The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that may result from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. I'm Nathaniel Darkish.
And I'm Mac.
I've dreamt of you. I craved you. Oh, I've missed you. Waiting for this very podcast. Time to float.
We are gonna flow all over the place on this episode.
Yeah, we'll all float on okay.
Ugh. This is a pretty big episode for us Scream Kings, Nathaniel. First, before we get too crazy, we should probably say sorry to all of our listeners.
Yeah, we're the worst.
Well, we're not the worst. We've just had life and pneumonia and mono and a new job, and it's been kind of a nutso August for us.
Yeah, that's fair. You know, as reference, you know, so I am now officially an English teacher, creative writing teacher, history yearbook. I've had a lot on my plate.
Basically everything. You're the school principal now.
Oh, yeah. I went from nothing to ruling the school.
So we are very, very, very sorry to everyone because our schedule has kind of gotten a little squampus, but this is the best time of the year. Halloween's just around the corner, and we're very excited for the last half of the year. And I think the theme of this episode, and if you haven't figured it out by now, then you dumb, is It Chapter 2, which is a really fun way to come back.
Yes, I am so thrilled because, one, as you'll quickly learn, I generally really like this movie, and two, this is really big because this is basically the sequel to our very first episode. If you'll remember, we talked the first It movie for our very, very pilot episode. And that means that this is actually falling on our 2-year mark, which is also just bonkers.
Which, it's crazy to me that we've come full circle. You know, you and I had talked about doing a blog at one point about horror movies. And then you had the brilliant idea of, hey, why don't we just do a podcast? And it was like, well, yeah, duh, that's so much better than a blog. Who blogs anymore?
Yeah.
That's so 2010.
Or 2003, let's be real.
That too.
Yeah, I've definitely loved the time that we spent doing this podcast. I'm kind of sad that we didn't make this our 28th episode. That would be 27 episodes after the original one. I think if we had thought of that, we might have found a way to finagle that. But, you know, we didn't. So let's just pretend.
We could just have 227 episodes.
Yeah.
We won't tell anybody.
It'll just be confusingly numbered.
Yeah, there we go. So I think we should really just dive into a few things for It Chapter 2. But before, sorry, I'm all over the place. I'm excited. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around with us. We've gotten some notoriety, which is really fun. We're kind of the premier horror podcast in the state of Utah, according to my research, which is even cooler. We've got a lot of traction. We've had some ups, we've had some downs, we've had some really awesome episodes, we've had some less awesome episodes. Thanks for sticking around and listening to us. We really do appreciate that people out there take time out of their 24 hours they're given and dedicate some of that to listen to me and my best friend talk about horror. It's amazing.
Yeah, we feel you're right in the Ghiblies.
In the Ghiblies. How do we come back from the word Ghiblies?
We don't. I guess it's over. It's all over now. We ended on a high note. The word Ghiblies.
Ghiblies into It Chapter 2. There's so much hype about this movie. It's ridiculous. So much hype.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. It was projected to basically be it's the sequel to the most commercially successful horror movie of all time. And yeah, so it was projected to make all the money. Like, you know, horror generally does really well in the box office, but the It movies just it's a kind of a whole nother echelon. It's the Avengers Endgame of horror, and yeah, like you can see why. It has the big budget, it has all of the stars, it really has a lot of that momentum. The big names. It is one of the most iconic horror novels of all time. Stephen King's by far the biggest writer living today, regardless of any genre. And yeah, the hype train was very real, and I feel like, at least for me personally, it really lived up to it in a lot of ways. A lot of critics seem to disagree with me, but they're wrong.
Another certain co-host of yours also agrees with the critics, so it's fine. We'll get to that.
Okay.
But serious note here, the hype I think was very well deserved. The trailers that we were given for it were stunning and beautiful.
Especially that first trailer with the Bev in her old apartment.
Yeah, which is really one of the most iconic scenes of the movie, and we'll get to that. But Pennywise is so ingrained in not only our generation, but I think the generation that came before us with the Tim Curry rendition. And so he's very much Pennywise in the zeitgeist of culture today. Mm-hmm. And you have queer jokes about Pennywise and the Babadook. And he started this whole weird spooky clown on the sidewalk with no intention kind of a thing. There's a lot of our culture that we have to give credit to Stephen King in this creation. So really, the hype was lived quite well, and I think the movie delivered in some regards.
So why are we so scared of clowns?
All right, so this is my mythos, my urban legend, my psychology
occult
degree,
corner.
My occult corner. We haven't done my occult corner in a while, or your literary corner, and we apologize because this got me a little too excited. I wanted to know kind of why we are afraid of ghosts, or not ghosts. Why we're afraid of clowns. And so I did some research and I found that the actual phobia, and I want to point out to our listeners that phobia is a very, very specific term used by the DSM to describe a crippling fear, a fear that is so intense it starts to affect you on a daily basis. It gets involved with your work or whatever.
Yeah, you can't function if you come across something.
Exactly. So a phobia of clowns is actually called coulrophobia. Not quite sure how that's pronounced, Mr. Englishman.
Probably coulrophobia.
And really, the research that I did behind this is quite fascinating. A lot of the phobias that we have out there are rooted in evolutionary systems. The fear of heights is because our primal brain understands that falling off of something high can kill you. So that's where that fear factor kind of comes into effect. Same with fear of bugs, fear of spiders, fear of snakes, all of these animals that clearly are less sophisticated than humans, and logically we probably shouldn't be afraid of them. But this primal brain of ours says, danger, danger, these animals are either venomous or poisonous and can kill us, so watch out. Clowns, it's a little bit different, and Freud is really the big player when it comes to fear of clowns, which was interesting in itself. We all have different opinions about good old Freud, but
he started good things, but he was in that.
He went crazy. He had a little too much narcotics, if you ask me.
Or just too much attraction to his mother.
There's that too, but, another day, another podcast. His research really dives into that a fear of clowns is not really rooted in what a clown is, but what is behind the clown. Clowns were meant to entertain, to make us laugh, to kind of allow us to forget about negative things that happen in life. But unfortunately, there's a lot of horrible stories about clowns and being killers and murderers and doing all sorts of unmentionable things since they first started coming around. And so Freud pushes the idea that clowns are a physical representation of a fear of the unknown. It's very similar to someone who might be afraid of deep waters. They're not necessarily afraid of water, they're afraid of the unknown that lurks beneath that water. So overall, we're afraid of clowns not because they're painted creepy faces. We're afraid of them because they look happy and they appear to be something very joyful, and they can turn on us in an instant. Phobias. We should do a whole episode on phobias. They're wild.
Yeah, or at least just kind of sprinkle them in as relevant, because I think a rich vein that we can mine.
I don't think there's any phobia of goats, though, because goats terrify me to no end.
I am confident I can find it.
Another podcast. Let's get into the bulk of this episode, this movie, It Chapter 2, Dear Old Pennywise.
By the way, it's caprophobia.
Oh, of course. Of course. We're not
Took me
discussing
3 seconds to find it. You caprophobic.
Well, Pennywise would turn into a giant goat for me, unfortunately, and I would wet myself.
So, just Black Phillip.
That's where my phobia comes from, I believe.
No, it was way before you watched that movie.
I mean, that's when it was cemented. Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? And the idea that Satan is possessing this giant black billy goat cements things very heavily. But the 3 evil nipping goats of my ex-wife also helped.
Oh, it was even before that. I remember in high school. But that is not the point. It Chapter 2. So, what did you love about It Chapter 2?
First and foremost, the acting was incredible, Nathaniel. Not only from the children, but also the adults. I mean, Bill Hader. Woof.
Yep.
Woof. I mean, he's not going to win an Academy Award because horror doesn't win Academies. But he was phenomenal. And Jessica Chastain was phenomenal. And I don't know. They were it was incredible. And not only their acting, but whoever casted this movie, I want
should
to
get an
hire
Oscar.
them. Yeah, no kidding. The adult actors were almost looked like relatives of the children actors, which blew my mind.
Yeah, can we talk about how good of a fit James Ransone was for Eddie? It was uncanny.
Yeah.
He looked the part. He played the part perfectly. Like that transition scene where it went from, Eddie as a child to Eddie as an adult. That was so freaking good.
Oh, it was... And even... Was it Ben? I'm sorry, The faces between fat little Ben and adult Big Ben were so similar for sometimes during the movie, and I've seen it twice now. I thought maybe the child had grown up and had become this adult actor. It's amazing. It's so amazing. Yeah,
man. Like, the only one that I didn't absolutely love their performance was honestly James McAvoy, which was kind of surprising because I think James McAvoy has some really good acting chops. But it felt occasionally like when he was kind of going into the fearful stuttering, it felt a little bit more like he was playing his little boy character from Split.
I agree. I definitely think he was the weakest out of all of them. And the stuttering was when I really started to notice it. It felt a little contrived, a little forced, not really authentic.
But even then, like, it wasn't that he did like a terrible job. It was just in comparison to the amazing, glowing performances of everyone else, it was just not quite as strong.
Totally agree. And I think, we got to give credit where credit is due, and that's Bill Skarsgård. Again, I think his performance rivals Heath Ledger as the Joker. I don't know how he got into the place he got, but I don't ever want to be there. To play Pennywise as well as Bill does, it's mind-blowing and terrifying. It would be difficult, I think, to be his friend when he was filming, because he had to have been in this weird, creepy, twisted place to really tap into some of the faces he would make, and the voice, and the, slow but controlled drool that was constantly coming out of his mouth. It's amazing what that man can do. Why is he not in more things?
I don't know. He's starting to get into more stuff. I've enjoyed his performances in anything else I've seen him in. Like, he was, for example, really good in Castle Rock.
Agreed.
And which, more Stephen King goodness. But yeah, so I love his work. I've read a lot of reviews talking about like how much he enjoyed working on It Chapter 2, which kind of brings me some happiness just as a fan that he got to have a little bit more fun and interact with other adults, because they kind of kept him isolated from the kids a lot just because they wanted the genuine fear from the children. But I love that he did stuff to like freak out Bill Hader and stuff on set, like just for fun. He was like, yeah, because I was reading a thing that I guess Bill Hader was like, oh man, like, so what, like, do they just do the eye stuff in post? And then he just like grins at him and does the eye thing because it's something he can actually do. And then he just like jumped back and is like, nope.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah. So I thought that was a lot of fun. So yeah, I mean, he did another tremendous job, and some of the nastiness,
oh my gosh,
that we get to see from him as Pennywise this time around was really upsetting and visceral, which was great.
Hold off on that because we have a whole section to talk about the scares of the movie.
Okay.
So overall, It Chapter 2 is an incredibly solid horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's long, it's almost 3 hours long, so definitely keep that in mind as you see it. And we can kind of get to that, how in some regards you could see that as a pro and a con.
Yeah.
But Nathaniel, you're an avid reader of everything Stephen King. You know the old movie inside and out. We've done this whole loop around. Give us some insight about how It Chapter 2 was better, I guess, than the book and then the original as far as plot goes, the roles of the characters. You have a lot of insight here that I think we can pull out.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I especially in the last time we talked about it, you know, I brought up the point that, you know, that the movie thankfully took away one of the most problematic scenes in the book, specifically the child orgy, which is what made them link together as opposed to them holding hands and making the oath. So this time around, we have some other stuff that has changed, and I feel like all of it really does a lot for the book. A lot to the story that the book didn't nail down as well. So one thing that they did is that they really, kind of shifted some of the roles of the characters. So in the book, Bill is still the fearless leader no matter what, and I didn't like that because, you know, he was one of the ones who left. He was one of the ones who still, you know, had a lot of reason to not necessarily be as invested. And so I like that they kind of shifted that leadership role to Mike this time around. I thought that was a smart choice. You know, he's plugged in. His stakes are much higher in this whole thing, I felt. And so I really like that, you know, he did all this research. He spent all of this time figuring all of this out. He gathered them together. It makes sense that he would continue to be the leader when they gather together. Because as an adult, he was the one who was there. He knows all of the information that they don't know. He remembers everything that they don't remember. And so, yeah, like, of course he's the leader. So I thought that was a big, smart change. I also like that they kind of cut some of the chaff that from the book. Like, for example, in the book, there is a sex scene between Bill and Beverly. And I didn't like that because, one, it's trying to sell us on this idea that Bill is, you know, committed to his wife. And also, like, you know, yeah, we saw the chemistry between them as children, but it didn't quite ever flesh out in an interesting way necessarily as adults. It was just like, oh, hey, they just randomly had sex during the middle of it. But, you know, but you're still kind of cheering for Ben over Bill, you know, for who gets to be with Beverly because, you know, he's the one who actually did the wooing and, you know, really showed specific concern for her and stuff like that. So, you know, I'm glad that they eliminated that. You know, like, yeah, there was a kiss. I think that was fine. But yeah, they took out, you know, kind of the intensity of that relationship. And then it just kind of like felt, at least to me in the book, it felt kind of unbalanced when, you know, Beverly and Ben have a moment too, because it's like, well, yeah, but she like slept with Bill and they just kind of like, oh, maybe we should see if we have something between us. And so it just, I don't know, it was different. Also, a big part of the book is that to kind of keep everyone there and kind of heighten the stakes for everyone, Audra, who is Bill's wife, actually comes to Derry to figure out what her husband's doing there, all that stuff, and then Pennywise takes her. And then he also, you know, once they defeat Pennywise, she's still catatonic because she got a big blast of the deadlights. And so in order to kind of revive her, Bill has to like put her on the back of his bike, and he rides the bike, and he's like, oh, it's magical still, and he, yells a hi-ho silver thing, and that's what like awakens her again. And it's this like joyous moment. But again, I didn't really buy that joyous moment and all of that time he invested, because he was so quick to drop everything for Bev. I don't know. Yeah, it didn't work for me in the book. It was cheesy. It felt out of place.
I think I did a little research, and I know that Audra comes back, but also Bev's like husband tries to come back and kill her. I think the characters are so developed and so fleshed out, and there's so much plot with them already. It's unnecessary to bring in these kind of random third-party characters. So I'd agree with you.
Yeah, they kind of just come in at the end. It just didn't feel like it fit. It was just kind of out of nowhere to like force them to, really finish things. But like I felt like, yeah, there was enough to these characters that would make them want to show down with Pennywise again, that we don't need another thing to make them do it. So those were some of the biggest things that I specifically recall as being noticeably different. And there was a few other things like Richie wasn't gay in the book, stuff like that. But I actually thought that addition ended up working out really well, especially kind of in contrast with the killing of someone who's gay at the beginning of the story.
So what do you feel about the Stephen King cameo? I know you made mention that a lot of people are kind of, I don't know, upset is the right word, but a little frustrated with the ending of the It novel and kind of how it plays out. And there's a lot of humor poked about endings being terrible and not really working out.
That I would say is very true. So, so the Stephen King cameo, he makes fun of Bill for not being good at writing endings in his horror novels. And, so, but what he's really doing is he's making fun of himself. And I like that because, one, it shows that he can have a sense of humor about his work. And two, it's kind of him acknowledging, hey, this is a better ending to this story. I didn't stick the landing in the book, and this is a better approach. And I liked that because, this is him, nodding and saying, this is probably the best version of this story that's out there. And I agree. I think it's better in this format. Now, I admit that there are some moments in the book that I liked that were better in terms of the scares. It is a little bit scarier in that it has more things it transforms into. It feels like, I don't know, it's scarier, and it's not always just Pennywise in different forms again and again and again. So I do like that about the book, but at the end of the day, if I have to choose any one version of it to be my favorite, it's definitely the films.
And I think that's a good kind of bridge into our next section, Liz. Let's talk about the scares of this movie, because it's such an iconic film that the scares have to be like next level. The first rendition of this movie, It Chapter 1, for lack of a better term, I guess, I thought had some incredibly brilliant scares. The scene in the basement with Bill and Pennywise like shaking out of the water to come try and get him terrified me. The film scene where they're in the garage and he comes out of the movie, that was terrifying.
So good.
It had a lot to live up to, and there are some really, really, really solid scares. And I think for me, two of the most unnerving ones were at the very beginning of the film, where we see some very intense and very violent homophobia, to the point where a few people in the LGBT community are a little upset that it's so intense, which honestly kind of shocked me. I feel like this is a fantastic medium to show some of those real life horrors that people in my community deal with and are very real in 2019, that this stuff is happening.
Yeah, this isn't just something from the past.
No, not at all. And I know this part was in the book, but this poor Adrian fella who's in a gay relationship ends up getting killed and eaten by Pennywise. And of course there's that supernatural murder aspect, but the bullying and the essential beating of this kid, this stuff really happens. And that set the tone for me for the rest of the movie. I was really excited that, It Chapter 2 was gonna kind of veer away from some of these childish fears, a leper, werewolves, blood, and kind of move into a lot of the deeper, darker fears that we experience as adults. And homophobia being so explicit in the beginning really set the pace, I think.
I agree. I feel like that is something that when the film did like really dug into these kind of like real life adult fears, the homophobia or dealing with the domestic and sexual abuse of Beverly and Pennywise playing on that fear, things like that I thought were really, really unnerving, upsetting, in a very real way. Because like those are some of the worst things that happen to people, but they're real. They happen every day. It's not just some monster chasing you around. This is a monster who is now adapting and showing you the things that you still fear as an adult. And so I liked that.
And I think it's important to go over a few of those fears. We have the homophobia, not only with the opening, but also with the Richie, Eddie kind of narrative, which I also really, really loved. There's not a ton of LGBT representation in the horror community. Mm-hmm. So to see this in such a big budget film almost made me a little proud of just like, yeah, they can do it. They did it. Let's keep more of it around. It helped diversify, I think. For Bill, I think his was kind of twofold. I think his life really wasn't what he wanted it to be, which I think at any point in adulthood we experience those same emotions. But also, he lost his brother. None of the other kids had lost a sibling. And so he had this feeling of it was his fault. He was guilty for Georgie's death. And again, that is such a ubiquitous fear that all adults have, I think, that they've regretted something that they've done in their life, and it sticks with them for years.
Yeah, and I liked that was his fear, and I liked that they had, this kind of mirroring of that with the little boy that he tries to save. I feel like they could have turned that up just a little bit more, like given us a stronger emotional connection between him and that little boy. Because if we had a stronger reason to kind of feel that connection, then I feel like his kind of character arc along that fear would have been stronger and would have been more interesting, especially when he fails again. But that one felt the most forced to me, and I think that's a shame, because I think, especially as a parent, that kind of inadequacy protecting a child is very easily one of the scariest things to me personally. And so I feel like that was a chance to maybe connect with the audience in a way that it kind of just didn't quite stick the landing on. But I liked the concept. I just don't think it nailed the execution.
Oh, I totally agree. And that scene in the funhouse with the mirrors and the glass is unfortunately one of Pennywise's more terrifying moments of this movie, and we can get to that in a bit. And it was very traumatizing and almost made you feel suffocated a little bit, because Bill was trying to save this kid, and this thick wall of glass separating him, and it was very well executed. But I agree with you is that there was some emotional connection that we were missing between Bill and this kid.
Yeah, I saw what they were going for, but it just didn't quite jive with me.
The regret of love for Ben and the Beverly story, I don't know if that's the correct term, but he always felt like he was in love with Bev, but was never able to say it out loud, or felt that she reciprocated those feelings. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's probably the most common fear in adults right now is, the one who got away. What if? And
yeah,
so
that kind of like romantic inadequacy.
Yeah, and in the final scenes where Ben is almost dying, he's getting buried alive, and I thought that was very symbolic of this feeling of, the one who got away. Sometimes we obsess and we become compulsive over that to the point where it kind of feels like it's burying us alive. And then Beverly, oh, poor Beverly. So not only was the homophobia scene incredibly upsetting to me, but I don't know if I've ever seen a movie where domestic violence is shown on the level that they showed it, in It Chapter 2. Like, there was a husband punching his wife, and I don't know if I've seen that before, and that kind of like took my breath away.
Man, you need to watch the Hallmark Channel more.
I guess so. It was intense.
It was an intense scene, but I would say that's not nearly as upsetting as the insinuated stuff with her dad. Like when he sprayed the perfume. Ugh.
Yeah, you read my mind, because I was just about to say, like, that was upsetting. And then we have this almost innocuous scene where Bev's dad is talking about how she essentially killed her mom and how she looks like she'll never be like her mom. And then he sprays this perfume all around her and him and gives this weird, creepy hug. And you just wanted to punch him in the face so much. It was harrowing.
Yeah, because you know that is just one instance of what is basically overtly sexual abuse between him and his daughter, and that's so it's so wrong on so many levels. Like, that kind of thing is just unconscionable to me, and so and it should be to anyone, and so that kind of thing, and then to see. It was so upsetting to see it then take that and play with that. And are you still a good girl? And you're like, oh,
yeah.
Oh, or are you still daddy's good girl? No, that is so wrong. And yeah, that the scene in which he is, it's a human Pennywise painting his face and shouting at her, and you kind of see this insinuation that if he were a human, he would be doing the same thing to his daughter or something like that. It's wrong. It's upsetting. It makes you angry, and it scares you because it's just so deeply morally, socially, just no matter how you slice it, it's wrong. But they did it like in a way that was tasteful.
Yeah, no, and they did it without any overtly sexual acts, which was very much appreciated. I can't talk today. I think Pazuzu's back inside me.
Uh-oh.
Moving aside from kind of the superficial, or not the superficial, excuse me, the profound horror of It Chapter 2, the superficial scares, I think, were really problematic, and we'll get into these a little bit more. The scariest scene for me was what you just kind of mentioned, was Bill Skarsgård pretending to be this relative of this old lady that Beverly met, who happened to look like Pennywise. There's plot holes and stuff there, I guess, that you could play with.
I wouldn't say it's plot holes. It's just one way that he's manipulating her again.
That's valid. Very valid.
Because he was the old lady, too.
True. Yeah, that's a good point. Anyway, he's essentially painting on the Pennywise makeup, and he takes his fingers and puts them at the top of his forehead and just pulls down. And the face that Bill Skarsgård makes is horrifying. This, I think, will be an iconic scene in the horror kind of community for years to come, on par with Reagan's puking pea soup and Jason's mom coming out of the ocean or lake. Freddy Krueger with his claws in the bathtub. Like, this was that level of fear and horror. It was brilliant, and it was a practical effect. Oh, I can't breathe. Lord help me. It was so good. If you don't want to see this movie, see it for that scene, or YouTube it, or I don't know what you have to do to see it, but it was beautiful.
Yeah, in the most frightening and upsetting way conceivable.
Yeah, exactly. Our listeners will get it.
Yeah, y'all get it. Y'all get us.
Y'all get it.
That's why you're listening.
The last thing I kind of want to say before we move into some of the cons about the movie is I have seen the original with Tim Curry, and it's classic and iconic, but I do feel like the ending in this rendition felt a little bit more cohesive to the story that they were telling.
That's because they didn't go with the Audra on the bike thing.
That, and also the whole, like, turtle creator of worlds versus it eater of worlds, kind of like random mythology thrown in our faces out of nowhere.
Hey, that's Dark Tower stuff.
No, and I totally understand that it is like part of the Stephen King universe. It just came out of nowhere with it. There was no like pathway to get there. And
I agree.
So I think by leaving that out in this remake, it did the universe a lot more of a favor.
I agree. I feel like the Dark Tower series is something that is magical in its own bizarre way, but I feel like there are certain Stephen King books that connect to the Dark Tower series, and I like seeing that connection from the Dark Tower side of things. But when I read them, I always kind of wondered, for everyone else who's picking up this book, like, I bet this part is really random and really weird and really throws you out of the book. And so, like, unless you kind of understand this greater universe, those kinds of moments, yeah, they aren't fair to the readers who this is their first Stephen King. And I think that's a shame because, like, you know, it does that. One of my very, very favorite Stephen King books, Insomnia, also does it. It has a huge connection to the Dark Tower series. And, you know, I feel like on its own, it should, you know, on its own merits, it should be easily, you know, one of his best books that everyone should read. But it's hard. It's harder for me to recommend it because I know that there's this big chunk of it that really, unless you understand the Dark Tower series, I think you're just going to go, I really like that book until that one random section, and then I just kind of stop caring.
So, let's move into some of the things we didn't really love about the movie. And
okay.
we have thoughts. We have a lot of thoughts. So,
Capital
I do want to...
T thoughts.
I do want to set the precedent that I really love this movie. I will buy it. I love the original. It's not perfect in any which way.
Yeah.
And I saw it with my boyfriend a few days ago, and he kind of asked me before we saw it what I thought about it. And I kind of gave him my little spiel. And he said, you know, like, that's great. Unfortunately, you're such a horror connoisseur now that sometimes I can't really trust your opinions on things because I'm such a commoner when it comes to horror movies. And I think that has a lot of merit for a movie like this. I think your average person who goes to see this is going to be terrified out of their pants. But for horror connoisseurs such as you and myself, we kind of have that critic eye for it, and I think that's going to come through over the next couple of minutes.
Yeah, that's fair. Our standard for what is scary is different than a lot of people's.
Agreed. And we'll get to that. That's kind of my ending point I want to make.
Mm-hmm.
But first, again, being, you know, a fangirl of Stephen King, I want to ask you, as far as the plot goes, do you think having all of the children forget the events that happened in Derry as they leave and move town, do you think that hurts or helps the narrative of the story as a whole? Because for me, it kind of made it a little bit weaker. It would have been fun to see this absolute terror and fear of the adults realizing that those 27 years were returning and then, like, struggling to get back to Derry and face those fears. Does that make sense?
I guess I see your point, but I feel like a counterpoint here is the fact that, in spite of remembering almost nothing, we have one of the Losers Club kill himself instead of facing Pennywise again.
And I agree with that, and I think he knew a little bit more than what Mike knew. I don't know, I kind of got that vibe throughout this movie. That Stan... I don't know, he sensed something. Maybe he was more empathetic to the feelings. I'm not quite sure.
I mean,
I
admittedly,
know.
Stan went up against Pennywise one-on-one and got his butt kicked and, you know, had his arm broken when he was a child. And so, admittedly, he did have a more specifically traumatic experience that was probably part of the reason why he had a stronger reaction. But, you know, we had to consider that, like, this is a dude who, for the most part, has forgotten. And so making just that one little connection and just having one little spark of it in his brain was enough for him to kill himself. They kind of
thought was powerful. Don't get me wrong. Like, the suicide scene with Stan is deeply upsetting.
Agreed. And so for me, I feel like it's not necessarily that them forgetting is bad or good, but to me it worked in that it showed how I don't know, to me it's almost symbolic, because really if you look at how adults approach childhood or approach, their interactions with children, so often adults forget what it's like to be children. And so I feel like kind of that's one of the big symbols of the book, is that, we as adults sometimes have to face things that we dealt with as children and couldn't. And those are real life things. Those, I'm talking about, things like abuse or things like, our childhood traumas that affect us as adults. And we have to face those, but we don't necessarily remember what it was like to really experience it. And we can dig that up, with therapy or things like that. But as a symbol, I think that's really powerful, to look and say, we as adults forget how to be children, and we forget what it's like to be children. We see children do something, we see them play, we see them be silly or stupid or whatever, and we go, what is wrong with them? And I see that all the time, especially now with my job as a high school teacher. And I still feel very connected with my high school self in a lot of ways. And I feel like a lot of my interests and a lot of my personality still is very much kind of grounded in who I was as a high schooler in a lot of ways. Not obviously entirely, but I still remember what it was like. But I feel like a lot of the other teachers don't. And it's interesting to see how their reactions to the stupid crap that teenagers do is so different than mine, because they don't remember. And so I think that is actually one of the most important parts of the book, is that they do forget. I agree that it does take away some of the scare factor at times, but I think that in terms of symbolic use, you need it there.
And I think that's a really, really good point. And I don't know if I've thought about that before, but it definitely ties into the whole fear element, especially where you bring up, trauma that happens in our childhood that we do forget. And then we're faced with something that unstabilizes us, and all of those fears come back. And I think you see that in this movie. And so that makes a lot more sense. And I feel much more comfortable with that narrative.
Yeah, and I mean, also, if you look at specifically how these people are living their lives, that trauma from their childhood is still affecting them, even if they remember it or not. Bev is in an abusive relationship. Eddie is with a woman who is exactly like his mom. Who is, controlling his life and telling him what to do, and is babying him constantly. We have these people who are still stuck in their childhoods, even though they don't realize it. And so I think that's fascinating, that they don't make that connection, because we don't often. We don't realize the things that shape us.
Yeah, I'm going to be thinking about that for a few minutes. That's great insight, Nathaniel. All right, well, now let's talk about the things we didn't like, now that I've had that, philosophical, insightful moment.
Yeah, now that I threw your other thing back in your face.
No, it wasn't a thing. I was seriously curious about it, because I've had a few people tell me that they really, appreciated that, but then others who have said it made the second part a lot more confusing because they didn't know what was going on. And so to look at it with that kind of a view, I think really helps the plot make more of an emotional connection.
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, but let's talk about what wasn't great.
Jump scares.
Oh my goodness, there are so many. To the point where anytime I saw Pennywise, I assumed there was a jump scare coming.
Mm-hmm. I think that really kind of boils down to, this was made for a mainstream audience. And I feel like a lot of mainstream audiences don't, if they don't have jump scares thrown at them, they don't think a movie is scary. They don't realize that, they can be scared for more reasons than just jumping in their seat.
I totally agree. And unfortunately, it works against this movie.
I agree.
I thought Chapter 1 had a very healthy dose of a few jump scares, but also that creepy, unnerving, we see Pennywise for the first time in the sewer, and he looks like just a creepy clown. But then the eyes go, and the drool, and everything kind of builds on itself to the jump scare. Here, I just thought they were dropping jump scares left and right. The scene under the bleachers was creepy, but the whole time I was thinking, okay,
when's the jump scare?
With that in mind, I wanted less jump scare and more kind of the focus on these psychological scares with the darker, more adult fears, like the scene with Bev and her dad, like the scene with Richie losing Eddie, a lot of those darker moments that they could have pushed a little bit harder on to make it really horrifying.
I agree. And I really wanted it to be that the creature, would then do more to play on those fears. Because, yeah, we saw it with Beverly, especially, but we didn't see it as much with the other characters. And I wanted to see that turned up to 11. I wanted to feel like their fears are more mature now. And so here is the more mature version of him scaring them.
And I think a real big issue with It Chapter 2 fell to the trope of a horror sequel. We know the monster, we know the demon, we know the ghost, we know the serial killer, we know whatever is coming. And so it's not as scary. We expect it. We anticipate those kind of jump scares. We anticipate the behavior. The drool was a fun new twist in this movie.
Yeah, he didn't have that many new tricks, and that was a shame.
We mentioned a little bit earlier that the length can be kind of a pro and con. For us, we were ecstatic to have a 3-hour horror movie. Like, that's a good evening for us.
Yeah, and honestly, to me, it didn't feel like it was 3 hours. I was happy with the length relative to how much content I got.
I think it's a double-edged sword, though, because when I went with my boyfriend and some 2 friends, the first thing they said when I asked how they liked it was, well, it was way too long. That they kind of got bored with it after a little bit. So that goes both ways, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say also, like, it kind of makes it so this movie isn't as rewatchable, especially if you want to do, like, a double feature, because now you're dealing with a 5-hour It marathon, and that's a lot of It. That's 2 hours longer than the miniseries was.
Why don't you talk to us a little bit about kind of the time frame? The first It was over a summer. Second It is over just a couple of days. How does that hurt the movie, in your opinion?
I just feel like the stakes aren't the same, because if you compress all of the bad that's going to happen into just a couple of days, it doesn't feel like it's as pervasive of a threat. Does that make sense? Like,
oh, absolutely.
Because, I liked the idea that Pennywise was hunting, and he wasn't just hunting them. It made it seem like he was doing so much more. While, when the adults come in, like, it feels like he just kind of drops everything and is like, okay, I'm going to deal with these people now. And it kind of makes his...
It turns into a revenge story.
Yeah, it does. And I don't like that, because that's not really what It is about. It is hungry and, sure, it's angry, but it should be this thing that is so much bigger and views them as so little in spite of everything they've already done to it, that it doesn't necessarily put all of its focus on them. So I like the idea of it taking place over a longer period of time.
And I think that's a very, very good point. And I felt like that at the end of the movie, especially where we got that awesome little clause that we stated at the beginning of the podcast, is it has been waiting 27 long years to kill these people. And I just wanted more ruthlessness out of Pennywise, I guess.
And that was a great moment, but yeah, I do want to see just a level of just constant hunger and malevolence that, just wasn't quite there.
So let's kind of bridge that in the end scene. Let's talk about spider/crab/scorpion/leech Pennywise that we saw in the end.
Yeah, And this was definitely a problem in the first movie, too. They rely on the Pennywise imagery too much, I think. It is not Pennywise. Pennywise is a comfortable, familiar form for it. But I don't love the idea that, it always has to be Pennywise or be partially Pennywise. I like the idea that it can turn into a werewolf, and it can turn into a leper, and it can turn into whatever it wants, and doesn't have to look like Pennywise the whole time. And so making this, end fight scene still be, a Pennywise face talking and shouting and crying and doing all the facial expressions on a big spider body, it just didn't work for me.
I agree. I feel like there was maybe a little too much Pennywise in the second chapter.
And the first chapter.
true. And even in the Tim Curry version,
Yeah.
Pennywise is scary, don't get me wrong. The clown is very unsettling. But the scene in the first one with Beverly and the blood pouring out of the faucet, that's powerful, and that's it. You know, like, give us more abstract fears. Really lean into that. And again, it comes back to this revenge idea that the top half of the spider crab was Pennywise. It made me less afraid of it because I've seen Pennywise for the last 4 years, you know? I didn't care as much.
I mean, like, I get that Pennywise is the iconic version of it, and that's fine. Use that in all of the marketing, whatever, but I don't need it in that scene. I understand that it is not just Pennywise. And I feel like they knew that we were smart enough as an audience to get that with the leper or get that with some of the other scenes, but they seem to forget that when it comes to, more monstrous forms.
Also, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I didn't love the comedy throughout the entire movie. I enjoy comedy in horror movies. We've established this. However, I think you have to do it very well. And there were just some little comedic spurts and jabs and scenes that I didn't feel like they were realistic. If I was in a situation like that, you would not be cracking jokes.
Yeah, and like, I get that, like, especially with Richie, like, that is his defense mechanism. Cracking jokes. Yeah, like, he should be making jokes at radically inappropriate times. But yeah, there were a few moments that I was like, they tried to go with a little kind of like little gag here or there that I was just like, that's not like the best time. Like, I don't want to laugh right now. I want to be upset or scared or whatever.
And I think that's a very good point you just made is, in the moment, what do I want to be? Do I need a little comedic relief, or do we just need to move the plot forward? And the scene I'm talking about specifically is where Richie and Eddie enter the 3 doors, and there's a scary, not at all scary, or extremely scary, or something of that type. And they open up the extremely scary, and it's this little Pomeranian. And it's this weird, like, 3-minute scene where they're cracking jokes and being all cutesy with the Pomeranian, and I'm just thinking, okay, is this really what they would do if there's a giant spider crab outside the cave? Like,
it felt like a break from the action in a way that didn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly. So,
yeah, I did not like that scene either.
In conclusion, like we've mentioned, I know we kind of have ranted a little bit about some of the weaker parts of the movie. I think it's a very solid movie. Mm-hmm. It's very Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And there's a level of horror there that's going to scare people, regardless of if you're a longtime horror fan or a newbie horror fan. And it did have a lot of quote-unquote scary scenes. Pennywise is very scary. Pennywise does set the stage for some really excellent horror. But movies like our one true savior, Hereditary.
Oh! I think it's a new record. We almost hit the hour mark without talking about Hereditary.
I was thinking,
but we didn't. We didn't. We tripped at the finish line there.
I need to start drinking when we record, and every time we say Hereditary, take a shot.
Oh man, you will be so plastered by the end of some episodes. And by some, I mean like 90% of our episodes.
My point being, though, is movies like Hereditary and even its sister movie, Midsommar, are unsettling, horrific, scary throughout. Even through the comedic scenes, even through plot developments. There's some level of unknown creepiness that you're not quite sure what's going on. Or it's pushing the boundaries, making you uncomfortable, kind of forcing you to squeeze your fists. Mm-hmm. And Chapter 2, in my opinion, does not do that.
Yeah, or at least it didn't do it nearly as much.
I just want to ask, did you prefer Chapter 1 or Chapter 2 better?
I liked 1 better. I've always liked the story of the children more. I felt like it was more scary. It was more interesting. I feel like the characters are more interesting people when they're children. But that said, I was really surprised at how much I enjoyed it, Chapter 2, considering that, like, when I read the book, I really didn't like the adult stuff very much at all. But I actually really did enjoy this take, and I felt like I understood the themes better this time around and all of that. And so, in spite of preferring the original, I would say, like, in terms of making or adapting the material and actually improving upon it, I would say this was actually a step up higher than we had with the original film versus its content or original material.
I agree with you 100%. I think It Chapter 1 introduced us to a new Pennywise, introduced us to a new set of incredible children, and really delivered something that we hadn't seen before in the horror genre.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that the It franchise suffers from sequelitis, is a new term I'm going to make.
Yeah.
Where we've seen it all before, and if you don't deliver on that next level, people are going to lose some interest in it in some regard. So,
yeah,
definitely prefer the first one.
Yeah, same. But I feel like they work really well as a two-part story. Like it's almost like unfair in a lot of ways to think of It Chapter 2 as a sequel, because it is. It's Chapter 2. And so that's why I think they called it It Chapter 2 as opposed to It 2.
Yeah.
Because it's still the same story. It's just more of it. It's the complete part.
And I wonder if one day we do need to just have like a 5-hour energy drink and watch them back to back and see if our opinions change at all. It might be a fun experiment.
Yeah, I would be down with that, because I feel like it would be fascinating to see how well it works in that sort of context.
With that said, I still give it 8 crowns. It's a very great movie. Acting is phenomenal. The scares are there. The plot is there. It has some fun comedic relief. Bill Hader wins the award for Best Actor in it. Great movie all around. I will buy this movie. I will own it. I have a Funko Pop Pennywise. Like, I love this. I love this story.
Yeah, I give it an 8 as well. It worked for me in a way that I just didn't expect it to. I let myself get excited for the movie, but was, kind of prepared to let my previous, general kind of meh feelings about the adult half of the story to ultimately win out. But I walked away from it going, man, I really enjoyed that movie. So yeah, an 8. How about Screams?
Screams, I gave it a 6. I've seen a lot scarier movies out there, even non-Hereditary Midsummer movies. Too many jump scares, too many predictable moments, and Pennywise just didn't deliver like it did. Do you see what I did there?
I do. We're back to the problem of confusing pronouns.
Seriously. Pennywise didn't deliver, I think, like it did in the first one.
Yeah, I agree as well. I'm giving it another 6 as well. It relied a little bit too much on the jump scare, but when it did go for the psychological, mature scares, it really did nail it. So I had fun, and I was pretty spooked out in certain moments. So yeah, good movie. Good movie.
Yes. Well, thank you everybody once again for sticking with us from It Chapter 1 to It Chapter 2. It's a big episode for us. We're kind of proud just to have made it this far. Sometimes I'll tell people I still do my podcast. And they're like, whoa, way to go. You stuck with it. And I was like, hell yeah, I did.
Yep. So speaking of staying with it, should we talk about how we're staying spooky this week?
Yes. Want to go first?
Sure.
Where you're on theme.
Yeah. So Stephen King dropped a new book today, The Institute, and I am just barely beginning it, but I am very excited to see where it's going. It seems like it kind of has a strong Firestarter vibe, if anyone's familiar with that Stephen King book, like dealing with like telekinetic kids and stuff like that. But so far, I'm digging it. I expect good things because, I've stuck with Stephen King through like 65 books, and I'm going to keep sticking with him.
One day, I'm going to get you some sort of pass to go meet him in person, and I will finally take over first place between you and Taylor, and I will win.
Ha! You will defeat
Your
us.
Wife.
Yeah, just defeat everyone in gift giving, because we make that a competition.
Exactly. For me, big fan of horror, all things horror. One that I've kind of like avoided, weirdly enough, has been true crime. It just didn't interest me as much as supernatural horror has. That is until I had to go fly to Tennessee and had a layover in Georgia, which was 3 hours long. So I downloaded the Mindhunter series that Netflix has produced, and holy cow. It's incredible. It's amazing. It's kind of more a psychological thriller, I'd say, than a horror. The general premise is it's about the FBI agent who founded the behavioral science unit. And so it's the story of how he has gone through all of these serial killers and goes to them in person and interviews them and starts to create the kind of the criminal profile of serial killers. And it's got Jonathan Groff in it, and he's a hunk, so that's fun. But it's one of those shows that you watch 4 or 5 episodes in and you've kind of forgotten what time it is because you're so enthralled and you're so pulled in. I would definitely check it out. They're on their 2nd season right now, and they have Charles Manson as one of the serial killers they interview, which is interesting because he actually never killed anybody.
Directly.
That's, valid. Also, we are developing a website, which will be dropping hopefully within the next few months, screamkingspod.com. You can go there. There's not a lot there. It's more or less a blueprint for what's to come. But we have big plans forthcoming, so stay tuned and stay spooky.
Stay spooky.
Need even more Scream Kings? Here's our obligatory shameless social media plug. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at ScreamKingsPod. You could also email us at screamkingspodcast@gmail.com. Help us reach a wider audience of horror fans by leaving a review on iTunes or by sharing a link on social media. You can also support the show by going to patreon.com/ScreamKings. Stay spooky.